My name is Lina Sterling. I'm 28 years old. For a decade, my parents have introduced me as the unemployed one, a professional drifter who couldn't hold a candle to my brother Julian's venture capital empire. They mocked my daydreaming at $10,000 a plate dinners, cut me out of the family trust, and treated my existence like a tax write-off. But at the Sterling Group's 50th anniversary gala, in front of the most powerful investors in Manhattan, a courier handed me a folder that would turn my parents' desperate begging into my greatest leverage. What they didn't know was that while they were busy liquidating my inheritance to save their failing hotels, they were actually trying to sell their souls to me. I wasn't just finding myself. I was building the firm that was about to own them. The Sterlings were Manhattan royalty, the kind of family that believed a person's worth was measured by the height of their skyscraper and the pedigree of their degrees. My father, Arthur Sterling, sat at the helm of Sterling Luxury Hotels, a global empire that was quietly bleeding $2 million a month behind its gold-leafed doors. Julian was the golden child, the Stanford graduate who could do no wrong, even as his investments crumbled. Then there was me. I was born with what my mother called a scattered brain. To them, my obsession with data and market patterns was just a symptom of someone who couldn't focus on real work. When I was 21, they stopped asking what I was doing and started apologizing for it. My parents' response to my unique mind wasn't curiosity. It was a quiet, polite erasure. They didn't realize that the daydreamer they ignored was actually architecting the most feared analytics firm in the industry. Apex. The crystal chandeliers in my parents' Upper East Side penthouse didn't just provide light. They served as a reminder of everything I was supposedly incapable of achieving. It was the night of the annual investors' soiree, an evening where the air smelled of expensive scotch and the kind of quiet desperation that only follows a bad fiscal quarter. My father, Arthur, stood near the marble fireplace, his laughter booming as he clapped a senator on the shoulder. "And here is our Julian," my mother, Celeste, chirped, guiding a group of venture capitalists toward my brother. 32 years old and already managing a portfolio that would make a seasoned partner sweat. He's the true engine of the Sterling legacy. Julian offered a practiced, humble smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile you buy with a Stanford MBA. I stood 5 feet away, holding a glass of sparkling water, waiting for the inevitable. My father's gaze finally drifted to me, and the warmth in his expression didn't just fade, it flattened into a look of professional pity. "And this is Lina," he said, his voice dropping an octave as if he were sharing a diagnosis. "Our resident free spirit. She's currently between pursuits. We like to say she's the unemployed one, keeping the rest of us humble." A few of the investors chuckled low, polite sounds that felt like sandpaper against my skin. One woman looked at me with genuine confusion. "Oh. And what did you study, Lina?" Before I could mention my master's in predictive modeling or the fact that I spent 18 hours a day analyzing the very market trends her firm was currently failing to predict, my mother intervened. "Lina has a very creative mind. It's a bit too unstructured for the corporate world. We've found it's best to let her find her own pace." With a gentle but firm nudge, my mother directed me away from the adult conversation. "Sweetheart, why don't you head over to the annex table? Julian's cousins are there. It's much more your speed." The annex table was a polite term for the kids' table. I was 28 years old, sitting on a folding chair between my 15-year-old cousin who was obsessed with Minecraft and a high chair. From this vantage point, I was literally looking up at the backs of my family. I watched Julian lean in to whisper something to my father, their heads bowed over a tablet displaying the Sterling Group's plummeting hospitality margins. They thought I was staring into space, lost in a daydream. They didn't realize I was mentally calculating the exact trajectory of their debt-to-equity ratio. I saw the flaws in their expansion strategy like cracks in a windshield. Under the table, my phone buzzed in my clutch. A notification from my head of operations at Apex. "The Sterling buyout offer is live. They're desperate, Lina. They have no idea it's us." I looked back at my father, who was currently laughing at another joke at my expense. I didn't feel the sting anymore. For the first time in a decade, the unemployed one felt perfectly at peace. After all, you don't mind being the resident failure when you're secretly the landlord. Chapter 2. The transition from the gold-leafed humiliation of the Sterling penthouse to the sterile high-frequency hum of my office was a physical relief. While my parents tucked Julian into the family legacy, I took a late-night Uber to a nondescript industrial loft in Long Island City. No brass nameplates. No museum plaques. Just a keypad with a rotating biometric code and a heavy steel door that bled no light into the hallway. This was the nerve center of Apex Analytics. Inside, the air was kept at a precise 64 degrees to protect the server stacks that lined the back wall like silent, black monoliths. There were no mahogany desks here, only ergonomic workstations and sprawling glass whiteboards covered in the daydreams my parents so despised. I sat at the center console, the glow of 6 monitors washing over my face in shades of electric blue and amber. My head of operations, Marcus, was already there, a headset slung around his neck. He didn't look at my vintage dress or my drugstore heels. He looked at the data. The Sterling Group just hit the S-curve, Lina, he said, tapping a screen showing a downward red trend. Their liquidity is a desert. They've overextended on the Macau expansion, and the interest on their mezzanine loans is about to reset. They're looking for a savior. I watched the flickering candlesticks of the market. To anyone else, it was chaos. To me, it was a structural map. I could see the exact moment my father's pride had overridden his logic. He had ignored the predictive models I'd tried to show him 3 years ago, back when I was still trying to find myself. They reached out to our shell firm, Vector Holdings, this afternoon, Marcus continued, spinning his chair to face me. They want a $50 million bridge loan. They have no idea Vector is a subsidiary of Apex. They have no idea they're asking you to pay for Julian's mistakes. I leaned back, my eyes tracing the flow of money on the screen. It was a masterpiece of incompetence. My father was offering the Sterling flagship hotels, the very soul of our family name, as collateral. If they defaulted, and the data said they would within 18 months, I wouldn't just own a company. I would own my father's life's work. Send the term sheet, I whispered. My voice didn't waver. Standard interest, but add the governance clause. I want a seat on their board for an anonymous observer. If they're going to drown, I want to be the one holding the oxygen tank. I looked at the unstructured diagrams on my whiteboard, the flowcharts my mother called scribbles. They weren't scribbles. They were a noose. As the sun began to rise over the East River, I realized that for 10 years, I had been a ghost in my own home. But in this room, the ghost was the architect. The 42nd floor of Whitford Tower smelled of floor wax and expensive anxiety. My father sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, his fingers drumming a restless beat against a leather-bound folder. To his right, Julian was adjusting his tie for the 10th time, his face pale under the harsh LED lights. They weren't here as the masters of the universe today. They were here as supplicants, though they were far too proud to admit it. We need to be aggressive, Arthur muttered, looking at the clock. Vector Holdings is a vulture fund. They smell blood. If we don't frame this as a partnership rather than a bailout, they'll strip the Sterling name off every lobby in Manhattan. I was sitting 3 chairs down, ostensibly there to take notes and fetch water, the unemployed daughter given a pity task so I wouldn't be wandering the streets. Julian didn't even look at me as he shoved a stack of papers my way. Lina, make sure the coffee service is ready for the Vector reps. And for God's sake, try to look professional. Don't doodle on the margins of the minutes. I smoothed the paper, my pen hovering over the blank white space. I wasn't doodling. I was mapping the room. The door opened, and Marcus walked in, flanked by 2 of my top-tier attorneys from a white shoe firm they'd never seen me enter. Marcus wore a suit that cost more than my father's car, his expression a mask of cool, Ivy League detachment. Mr. Sterling, Marcus said, ignoring my father's extended hand and taking his seat. We've reviewed your proposal for the $50 million bridge loan. To be frank, your numbers are optimistic. Our internal analytics suggest your occupancy rates are inflated by 12%. Arthur stiffened. Our data is proprietary and verified. Our data is better, Marcus countered. He glanced at me for a split second, a microsignal we'd practiced. I nodded almost imperceptibly. In fact, we have a specialized algorithm at our parent company Apex that predicts a total liquidity collapse for the Sterling Group by Q4. Unless, of course, you accept our amended terms. Amended terms? Julian scoffed. We're already giving you the flagship hotels as collateral. We want more than collateral, Marcus said, sliding a new contract across the table. We want an anonymous board observer with full veto power over all new capital expenditures. And we want a drag-along clause. If Apex decides to sell their stake, you are forced to sell yours at our price. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. This is an execution, not a loan. You're trying to crush us. We aren't trying to crush you, Arthur, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a predatory whisper. We're trying to own what's left of you before you finish the job yourself. I sat in the corner, my pen scratching silently against the paper. I watched my father's hand shake as he reached for the contract. He looked at Julian, looking for a brilliant countermove that would never come. Then he looked at me, his eyes filled with a dismissive irritation that I was even witnessing his moment of weakness. He had no idea that the unstructured mind he'd mocked for 20 years had just written the script for his surrender. He signed the paper with a flourish of desperate bravado. Welcome to the family, Marcus said, his eyes meeting mine. The fallout from the board meeting didn't take long to reach the unemployed wing of the Sterling household. 2 days later, I was summoned to my father's private study. The room was heavy with the scent of old leather and the lingering humidity of a rainstorm over Central Park. My brother Julian was already there, leaning against the mahogany bookshelf with a look of smug satisfaction that usually preceded a kill. Sit down, Lina, my father said, not looking up from a legal ledger. He looked tired. The Vector Holdings deal had clearly aged him 48 hours in 2 days. I sat. Is something wrong? Everything is wrong, Julian snapped, stepping forward. He tossed a thick manila envelope onto the coffee table in front of me. The seal was broken. Dad and I have been reviewing the family's consolidated assets. With the new Apex oversight and the Vector loan, we have to make some executive adjustments. Adjustments? I asked, my voice steady. We're liquidating the secondary trust, my father said, finally meeting my eyes. His gaze was cold, clinical. The one your grandmother set up for your future. Julian needs the liquidity to shore up the venture fund's margins. It's the only way to keep the Sterling Group's credit rating from hitting junk status. I looked at the papers. It wasn't just a liquidation. It was a total severance. They were stripping away the last safety net I had, the modest fund that paid for my unstructured life. You're disinheriting me to save Julian's bad bets? I asked. We're prioritizing the family's survival, Lina, Julian interjected, his voice dripping with condescension. You don't have a career. You don't have a mortgage. You barely have a life. You're a free spirit, remember? Free spirits don't need 7-figure trust funds. Besides, we've already paid for your hobbies for 28 years. It's time you stood on your own 2 feet. My father stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. We've arranged a small severance. $50,000. It should be enough to get you a nice apartment in the suburbs. Perhaps something more suited to your modest abilities. We'll need your key to the penthouse by Friday. I looked at the document. This was the trust fund trap. They thought they were cutting me adrift, forcing the unemployed one into a life of quiet poverty where I could no longer embarrass them with my presence at their galas. They thought they were taking my power. What they didn't realize was that they were actually handing me my freedom. By dissolving the trust, they had removed the last legal tie that required me to be Lina the daughter. I was no longer bound by family loyalty or the fear of losing an inheritance I never actually wanted. Is that all? I asked, standing up. Julian chuckled. You're taking this remarkably well. I expected tears. Or at least a tantrum. I'm just realizing how much you've underestimated the cost of things, Julian, I said, tucking the severance check into my bag. The trust was worth $4 million. You think that's enough to save you? You're burning the lifeboats to keep the lights on in the ballroom. As I walked out of the study, I pulled out my phone. I didn't call a realtor. I called Marcus. Spring the default trigger on the mezzanine debt, I told him. The Sterlings just liquidated their last liquid reserve. They're officially insolvent. It's time for the silent partner to make a formal introduction. The air in the corner booth of the iron rail was thick with the scent of aged leather and expensive cigars, a stark contrast to the sterile high-tech glow of my Apex headquarters. Across from me sat Margaret Thorne, the longest-standing board member of the Sterling Group and the only person who had ever looked at my childhood daydreams with anything other than pity. They did it, didn't they? Margaret asked, her voice a low rasp. She didn't need to specify what it was. She had seen the emergency filing. Arthur and Julian liquidated your trust to cover the Macau interest payments. They're burning the furniture to keep the furnace going. They think they've sidelined me, Margaret, I said, sliding a tablet across the scarred wooden table. They think I'm looking for a studio apartment in the suburbs with my $50,000 parting gift. Margaret put on her reading glasses, her eyes narrowing as she scrolled through the proprietary data I'd compiled. It wasn't just financial projections. It was a forensic autopsy of Julian's venture fund. I had tracked every shell company, every creative accounting entry, and every over-leveraged asset. "My God, Lina," she whispered, a slow smile spreading across her face. "You didn't just find the leaks. You've mapped the entire collapse. Julian isn't just failing. He's committed structural fraud to hide the Vector Holdings debt from the other board members. Arthur is blinded by the legacy. Julian is blinded by his own ego," I said. "But the board is blinded by the Sterling name. They need a reason to stop believing the lie." Margaret looked up, her sharp, intelligent eyes meeting mine. "I've been on that board for 30 years. I watched your grandmother build the first hotel with her own 2 hands. It breaks my heart to see what Arthur is doing to it. He's turned a legacy into a house of cards." "I don't want to destroy the company, Margaret," I said firmly. "I want to save it. But I can't do that while Arthur is holding the wheel and Julian is navigator. I need the board to call for a vote of no confidence at the 50th anniversary gala." "A vote of no confidence," Margaret chuckled. "In the middle of their biggest celebration? It would be a bloodbath." "It would be a hostile takeover from the inside," I corrected. "Apex already owns 22% of the debt. If you can flip the 3 swing votes on the board, we can block the merger and trigger the governance clause. But I need you to be the one to introduce the motion. They won't listen to the ghost. They'll listen to you." Margaret leaned back, tapping her pen against the table. The risk was enormous. If we failed, Arthur would sue her into oblivion and I'd be blacklisted from the industry before my name was even known. "And what do you get out of this, Lina?" she asked. "Besides revenge? I get to stop being a ghost," I said. "And the Sterling Group gets a CEO who actually knows how to read a spreadsheet." Margaret reached out, her hand steady as she gripped mine. "Your grandmother always said you were the sharpest one in the room. She just didn't tell you the room was full of mirrors. Consider me your first ally." The countdown didn't start with a ticking clock. It started with the arrival of the invitations. Heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold-embossed lettering. The Sterling Group 50th Anniversary Gala. A half-century of excellence. To my father, it was a victory lap. To me, it was a funeral for the way things used to be. With the trust fund liquidated, my parents had officially stopped pretending I existed. My key to the penthouse had been collected by a grim-faced security guard, and my childhood bedroom was already being converted into a meditation suite for my mother. I spent the next 48 hours in a blur of blue light and caffeine at the Apex loft. "We're cutting it close, Lina," Marcus said, his eyes bloodshot as he toggled between windows. "The merger agreement with the offshore buyers is set to be signed at 10 p.m. during the gala. If Arthur puts pen to paper before we trigger the injunction, they'll strip the company's assets and move the capital to the Cayman Islands. We'll be chasing ghosts for a decade." I looked at the monitors. The Sterling debt was moving like a landslide. My father had authorized a last-ditch sale of the hotel's flagship properties to a shell company he believed was a savior. He didn't realize that the shell company was a subsidiary I had created specifically to catch the falling knife. "The board is wavering," I said, checking my encrypted messages from Margaret. "She's flipped 2 of the 3 votes, but Richard Holloway is holding out. He's old school. He doesn't believe a shadow firm like Apex has the liquid capital to back a full restructuring." "Then show him," Marcus urged. "Reveal yourself now. If you go to him as Sterling, he'll listen." "No," I whispered, my gaze fixed on a photo of my grandmother on my desk. "If I show my hand too early, my father will use every legal dirty trick in the book to freeze my accounts. He has to believe he's won until the very second he loses." The ticking clock was now measured in hours. I had 36 hours to finalize the reverse takeover documents and 24 hours to find a dress that would allow me to blend into the shadows one last time. My mother sent a final text. "Lina, please don't make a scene by showing up uninvited tonight. It's Julian's big night, and we've already had enough embarrassment for 1 year." I didn't reply. I was busy reviewing the notice of default that would be served at the height of the party. The Sterlings wanted a gala. I was going to give them a revolution. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a sea of black ties, silk gowns, and the distinct metallic scent of old money. I stood near a fluted marble column, wearing a floor-length emerald silk dress I'd bought with my own hard-earned company dividends, not the family allowance. No one recognized me. To the waiters, I was just another guest. To my family, I was invisible. The orchestra reached a crescendo as my father, Arthur, stepped onto the podium. He looked every bit the patriarch. Silver hair perfectly coiffed, a smile that radiated a confidence he no longer possessed. Julian stood just behind him, preening like a crown prince awaiting his coronation. 50 years ago, Arthur began, his voice amplified by the gilded acoustics of the room. The Sterling name became synonymous with a certain standard. Tonight, as we prepare to enter a new era through a historic merger, we celebrate not just a company, but a legacy of leadership. He paused, his gaze scanning the room until it landed, with calculated cruelty, on me. I saw the flash of irritation in his eyes that I had dared to show up. Of course, he continued, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Leadership isn't for everyone. Some are born to build empires. Others are born to enjoy the view. My daughter, Lina, is a perfect example of the latter. She reminds us every day that while the rest of us are toiling to maintain this excellence, someone has to be the unemployed one, who simply drifts through the world we've built. A ripple of stifled laughter moved through the front rows. My mother, Celeste, leaned over to a socialite and whispered something that made them both chuckle while looking directly at my vintage, actually high-end, accessories. The humiliation was a sharp, cold needle, but I didn't flinch. I let the shame wash over me, knowing it was the last time they would ever have the power to cast it. But tonight isn't about those who watch, Arthur roared, his voice regaining its boardroom thunder. It's about those who act. Julian, come forward. Julian stepped to the mahogany table on stage, where a thick legal binder sat waiting. The merger documents. My father picked up a gold fountain pen, the same one he'd used to sign the liquidation of my trust. By signing this, we secure the Sterling future, Arthur announced. We merge our interests with a global partner that understands the value of our name. Julian, as the incoming CEO, the honor is yours. The room held its breath. Julian uncapped the pen. Across the room, Margaret Thorne caught my eye. She gave a single, sharp nod. I pulled my phone from my clutch and sent one final, encrypted command, execute. Just as Julian's pen touched the signature line, the massive double doors of the ballroom swung open. The sound echoed like a gunshot. 6 men in dark suits, led by Jonathan Ellis, the same attorney who had helped my grandmother secure her final wishes, marched down the center aisle. Mr. Sterling, Jonathan's voice rang out, cold and authoritative. I suggest you put that pen down. You no longer have the legal authority to sign for this company. The music stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. The golden pen hovered millimeters from the paper, the ink a dark promise of my family's survival. Julian's hand froze, his face a mask of confusion that quickly sharpened into arrogance. Ellis. Arthur's voice boomed, though it lacked its usual weight. What is the meaning of this intrusion? This is a private event and a confidential signing. Jonathan Ellis didn't slow down until he reached the foot of the stage. He didn't look at the cameras or the 300 confused socialites. He looked directly at my father. As of 9:58 p.m., the Sterling Group has been served a notice of default on its mezzanine debt. Under the governance clause of the Vector Holdings Agreement, the board's signing authority has been suspended pending an emergency verification of assets. That's impossible. Julian spat, slamming the pen onto the table. We just liquidated the secondary trust to cover those margins. We're solvent. The trust liquidation was insufficient, Jonathan countered, pulling a notarized document from his briefcase. Furthermore, the board has just concluded an emergency vote. A motion of no confidence has been passed against Arthur Sterling and Julian Sterling, effective immediately. A gasp swept through the room like a physical wave. My mother gripped the back of her chair, her face draining of all color. Arthur staggered back, gripping the podium for support. On whose authority? Margaret. You wouldn't have the votes. She didn't need them, a new voice joined in. Margaret Thorne stood up from the front table, her expression one of grim satisfaction. The majority shareholder exercised their right to override. And since the Sterling Group defaulted on the Vector loan tonight, The drag-along clause was triggered. "Who is this majority shareholder?" Arthur screamed, his composure finally shattering. "Who is the coward hiding behind these shell companies?" I felt the weight of the room shift. The column I had been hiding behind no longer felt like a shield, it felt like a cage. I stepped out into the center aisle. The emerald silk of my dress caught the light of the chandeliers, shimmering like a signal fire. "It's not a coward, Dad," I said, my voice steady and clear, echoing through the silent ballroom. "It's the unemployed one." The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I walked toward the stage, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. My father's eyes widened, his mouth working but no sound coming out. Julian looked like he'd been struck. "Lina," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing? Get down from there before you embarrass yourself further." "I'm not embarrassing myself, Mother," I said, reaching the stage and taking the folder from Jonathan's hand. I turned to face the room, the investors, the bankers, the people who had laughed at me only 10 minutes ago. "My name is Lina Sterling. I am the founder and CEO of Apex Analytics. As of 5 minutes ago, Apex has completed a reverse takeover of the Sterling Group." I looked at Julian, whose face was now a sickly shade of grey. "The merger is cancelled, Julian. And you're fired." I turned to my father, who was staring at me as if I were a stranger he'd just met on the street. "You wanted a savior, Dad. You just didn't expect it to be the daughter you didn't think was worth a seat at the table." The morning after the gala, the 42nd floor of Sterling Tower felt different. The frantic, ego-driven energy that had defined the office for decades had been replaced by a quiet, surgical precision. The Italian marble still gleamed, but the portraits of my father and brother had already been removed from the reception lobby. I sat at the head of the walnut conference table, the same seat my father had occupied when he tried to crush his rivals. Marcus stood to my left with a stack of NDAs, and Margaret Thorne sat to my right, looking younger than she had in years. The door opened, and Arthur and Celeste walked in. They didn't storm in, they shuffled. My mother's designer suit looked crumpled, and my father's shoulders were hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor. Julian wasn't with them. He had been escorted from the building by security 3 hours earlier after trying to delete the venture fund's server logs. "Sit down," I said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a directive. My father took his seat, his hands trembling as he placed them on the table. "Lina, we didn't know. If you had just told us about Apex." "If I had told you," I interrupted, "you would have tried to take it. You would have folded it into the Sterling Group to cover Julian's losses, and you would have managed it into the ground just like you did the hotels. You didn't want a partner, Dad. You wanted a scapegoat." My mother reached across the table, her voice thick with forced maternal warmth. "Sweetheart, surely we can move past this. We're family. We can announce a joint leadership. It would look so much better for the press." "There is no joint leadership, Mother," I said, sliding 2 envelopes across the table. "Inside those are the terms of your exit packages. You'll keep the house in the Hamptons and a modest stipend, provided you sign a lifetime non-compete and a non-disparagement agreement. You are officially retired." Arthur looked at the documents, then up at me. For the first time, I didn't see pity or disappointment in his eyes. I saw fear. But beneath the fear, there was a flicker of something else, grudging realization. "The hotels," he croaked. "What happens to the hotels?" "I've already initiated the turnaround," I said, tapping my tablet to pull up the new organizational chart. "I'm keeping the staff, but the executive level is being gutted. We're moving to a data-driven model. No more vanity projects. No more legacy spending. The Sterling name stays on the door because Grandma built it, but the decisions happen in my office." I stood up, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city. From here, the world looked like a series of patterns, a vast network of data points waiting to be connected. My parents stood as well, clutching their exit papers like shields. "You spent 20 years telling me I was the unemployed one, because I didn't fit your mold," I said, turning back to them. "But while you were busy trying to mold me, I was busy learning how the world actually works. I'm not the resident failure anymore." I walked to the door and held it open. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a board meeting to lead. My assistant will show you where to leave your badges." As they walked past me, silent and defeated, I felt the final weight of their expectations lift off my shoulders. I wasn't just Sterling, and I wasn't just a ghost. I was the architect of my own empire. Description. Headline. My parents called me the unemployed failure. Then I bought their company. Description. Lina was the black sheep of the billionaire Sterling family, mocked for being unemployed at every dinner. But when her father's empire faces a $50 million collapse, she reveals a secret that flips the power dynamic forever. Watch the ultimate underdog to CEO transformation.